Alright, so in this video we're going to talk about how we can utilize the brush engine inside of Photoshop to generate some interesting design effects using some text, some simple text, and generating a custom brush. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and select my type tool. I'm just going to click once in the middle of this document right here. That text layer is set. I'm going to go up here. I'm just going to hold down my shift key so I can get a capital letter, and I'm just going to hit X on my keyboard. Now, in this case, the font that I'm using is, of course, already in place. If I double-click to highlight the text there, you can see that my font is set to Trajan Pro Bold. Now, of course, you can certainly use any font you like for this effect. I've just chosen this effect because it is, in fact, one of my favorite fonts. So, with that in place, I'm going to select my Move tool. I'm going to bring up my free transform by pressing Command or Control T. And then holding down the Shift and the Option key, or Shift Alt, let's scale this out from the center proportionally. And not too big. Let's make it right about that size there. So we've got our text in place. I'm going to load that text shape as a selection by holding down my Command key and clicking right on that little T icon on the layer. So it loads that text as a selection. I'm going to go under Edit to define brush preset. Now we'll get to name the brush. We'll call it X brush. Hit OK. I'm going to deselect it by pressing Command or Control D. Now on that same text layer, I'm going to double click on the icon to highlight the text, and then I'm just going to hold down my Shift key again, and this time type the letter O. And then go back to my Move tool, load as a selection again by holding down the Command or Control key. Go under Edit, define brush preset. We'll just call this one O brush. Now, I'm going to deselect that and turn off this layer. I don't need it at the moment, but I'm not going to throw it away just yet because I may need to go back to it. But I am going to go ahead and create a new layer. Go to my brush tool, and I'm going to bring up my brush options here. This big window here. And by default, I'm going to go ahead and turn these off because we're going to turn these on in just a second in a different way. But we're going to go to Brush Tip Shape, and there you can see in our menu here we have our X and O brush that we just created. I'm going to start with the X brush, and by default you see that they are aligned and evenly spaced out. Well, we don't really want that. First thing we're going to do is click on Shape Dynamics here. And you can see we've got all different types of settings we can apply here. I'm going to take the size jitter, very first one up here, push it all the way over. I'm going to change the control of it to pen pressure because I am in fact using a pressure sensitive tablet. Now if you weren't using a pressure sensitive tablet, you can certainly leave this to off and these settings will apply just fine. But in my case I'm going to go ahead and leave it on pen pressure. I'm going to go down here to angle jitter. I'm going to push this all the way over. You can see what happens to those X's as I do that. They're tilting in all different directions depending on how far I move this slider. But I'm going to push it all the way over. I'm going to set this control to pen pressure as well. Then for the roundness jitter, I'm actually just going to push this probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 50. But you can see what's happening with those X's as I do this. You can see they're almost tilting and turning away as if they were in a three-dimensional space. And that'll be cool for the effect, how we're going to apply the effect in a little bit. Actually, let's take it up. I'm going to do it around 75. But I'm going to leave the control for this one off, just so it does it in its own way. I'm going to drop the minimum roundness down, probably to closer to 5%, just like that. Next, I'm going to activate the scattering in this brush. So turn on scattering and highlight that so we can see those controls. And we want to make sure that we have both axes checked here, and we want to make the scatter go all the way to 1000%. We really want it to just scatter everywhere. If I bring the scatter all the way back down, 0 does nothing, and as it pushes out, scatters even more and more, so I'm going to max it out. I'm going all the way out there. I'm going to do one last thing. I'm going to go back in Brush Tip Shape, and down here at the very bottom you see it says Spacing. I'm going to take that push spacing slider, push it closer to like 50%. Right about like that. So if I get too low of a number, it's going to be really crowded in there. You can see it's scattered all up in there. So we get around 50 just so it's not so crowded when I start to paint this down. Alright, so let's push our brush palette out of the way and let's paint a little and see what we get. So we're getting a pretty interesting effect there. I'm actually going to make that brush a little smaller. I'm going to use my left bracket key. Drop it down a couple of notches. Now let's brush now. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Alright, so once I've got all my parameters of my brush set, before I do anything else, I'm going to go into my brush preset here. I'm going to go over here and go to New Tool Preset. Let's give it a name. We'll call it X Brush 1. Boom. There. That brush is fixed and set. So anytime if I go to another tool and come back to it, it is going to have the same exact settings as it did before. So that is all set. Let's go back over here into our brush engine and let's select that O brush that we created. Now, here's something that's pretty cool. If you're working in the same brush window and you've modified a brush setting, if you go and select another brush, a lot of those settings will be sticky in a sense that, oh, let's get that one right there. That is the correct one. I've got so many down here. Here's that O brush we created. So as I was saying, a lot of the settings will be sticky in a sense that they will apply to a new brush whenever you are selecting it inside the little brush menu there. So you can see in Shape Dynamics, all the same settings have applied. It's 100%, pen pressure, all this, the scattering, all that has been applied. The only thing that's different, the only thing it didn't change that we're going to have to go here and do is back in the brush tip shape, you can see that the spacing on that last brush, we set it to 50. Well, it's defaulted back to 25% in this case, so we're just going to push that back up. But all those same settings have been applied, and since I know how that brush behaves, I don't really need to test it. I'm just going to go over here, and we'll save this brush again. We'll call this the O brush. Not the OI brush, the O brush. And then we'll hit OK. I'll move that out of the way. Now, I can certainly, after a brush has been saved and I select it, I can certainly change its size by using my bracket keys and doing whatever. All those parameters will, all the other parameters will remain intact. So now on this file, I have created a background. And on this blank layer here, I'm actually going to move it below this text here. And making sure that we are starting, I'm actually going to start with my X brush here. Nope, I want to go to the preset X brush. X brush 1. And I'm going to make sure that I'm painting with white in my foreground. So I'm just going to click this little arrow, bent arrow key to flip those colors to make sure that white is in my foreground. Then, inside my document, I'm just going to start painting. Not too many, but just a few, just like one quick stroke there. I'm going to simply change that layer's blending mode to overlay. You try certainly many other blending modes and see what kind of results you get. Let's stick with overlay. We'll create a new layer on top of that one, and this time we're going to go and select that O brush. And again, making sure we're painting with white, so we'll flop that color. We'll just paint some O's in there. Usually I'll just kind of paint a couple of times till I get the right configuration I want. Just like that. And as before, change the blending mode to overlay. And there we have a really interesting background. All I got to do is drop some text in here. And let's say combine these two layers. Actually, let's go ahead and combine them in a group. If I select both of these layers, which are both the X and the O background images, if I go into this menu here and go to New Group from Layers, what it'll do is drop those two layers into a group here, which I can now apply a layer mask to the group. So if I create a layer mask, go get my gradient tool, and let's make sure we got black set as our foreground, so let's just flop these colors again. And up here, we're going to make sure we're going from black to transparent, but over here we're going to make sure we're using this fourth icon here, which is reflected gradient. So starting about the middle of the text, I'm going to hold down my Shift key and just drag down. You can see it'll mask out that middle area, making that text a little bit more readable. But if I turn this down, I haven't done anything to the layers. It's masking them as a group. So that's giving me a great deal more control over it. So there's an extra little tip there for you, masking a group. The real tip, creating brushes from text, getting you some interesting design effects. All right, so there you have it.